In the Mahabharata, there's a short passage where it describes a 10-year war with the island of Atala. And it says, at the end of which the inhabitants and the island sank into what they called, quote unquote, the Western Sea. That's actually quite convincing as far as a pre-Platonic source. So already before we get to the Greeks who were transmitting, of course, this ancient Egyptian story, we have here in the Turin King list their own version of events.
Both Herodotus and Plutarch are telling us that Solon truly went to Egypt, and even they are telling us that he was a little bit inspired by the Egyptian laws. And
Yes.
these are two of the biggest historians.
As the Egyptians told Solon, let's recall as well that when they told him that, they specifically said the earth was destroyed by the declination of heavenly bodies. So objects falling from the sky rained on earth and wiped out whatever was there around 9,600 BC. That's what they told Solon. All right, well, welcome back. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some pre-Platonic sources of the Atlantis story. I'm here with my little brother, Aleksander Czeszkiewicz. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes, you almost nailed it, as it is in Polish.
Czeszkiewicz. A lot of
Czeszkiewicz.
Czeszkiewicz. If you tell me once, I'll get it, just like with my Chinese.
Czeszkiewicz.
Czeszkiewicz. Okay.
Yeah, that was nice.
There we go. Spoken like a true Pole. Well, today, I'd like to read a little bit from the book as well here from Visions of Atlantis. And, you know, it's a common, I had a colleague of mine, great researcher and kind of, he's a sculptor, but he works with Egyptologists, and he himself is a kind of jack of all trades and has been to Egypt many times and studied specifically the Sphinx, and has a very, I think, compelling alternative to what the Sphinx is, and just in general how Egypt plays a role in this whole story. But when he read my book, he was one of the first people like you to read it in 2022 when it came out, and he really was impressed by the pre-Platonic sources, because so many people, when they're coming at this from a kind of contrarian standpoint, love to point out that, and as I've cited in the book, even major so-called debunkers and journalists have used the, well, before Plato there was nothing, as a kind of opening attack on the idea that Atlantis itself was, you know, not grounded in historical reality, which, as I think we'll see, it absolutely was. Details of what exactly it was notwithstanding, but the idea that it's purely fictional, and an idea of, you know, Plato with his noble lie, and, you know, a famous satirist, and, you know, not just philosopher, but, you know, allegorical writer. So it's important to actually see that the story didn't just begin with, even, let's just say, Solon, who transmitted it to Plato, that there are other cultures actually around the world that described Atlantis by name, some using kind of loose, hard and fast descriptions of some sort of island that sank into the Western Ocean around 10,000 BC. But I'd like to point some of those out. And so I start in the book actually with one of the oldest sources that I could find that mentioned Atlantis, and that's from India. And of course, like many ancient texts from India in Sanskrit, it's very difficult to place the original origin of, say, the Mahabharata. And I remember when I was writing the book, I spoke to a few professors who spoke Sanskrit and were experts in India, and they told me, I had two tell me straight up to my face, anybody that tells you they know how old the Mahabharata is, you know, take it with a grain of salt, because, you know, I use the conservative date of 1000 BC, but one of the leading experts on the subject, and I asked him, I double checked, you know, many times, he swears that text is over 10,000 years old. The story it's describing took place around the end of the Younger Dryas, and that the version that was transmitted perhaps was documented and copied later, but he swears that story is describing, events at the end of the Younger Dryas, which is very interesting. But just taking the conservative date, let's say, Plato lived around 350, 360 BC. Well, even if we go to the conservative date of 1000 BC for the Mahabharata, that certainly puts it in the pre-Platonic category. And in the Mahabharata, there's a short passage where it describes a 10-year war with the island of Atala, as they call it. And it says, at the end of which the inhabitants and the island sank into what they called, quote unquote, the Western Sea. Now, that's not an insignificant reference. That's actually quite convincing as far as a pre-Platonic source. They didn't just say there was an old war between this country. I mean, they're naming Atala, and they're talking about, a specific time period, a 10-year war at the end of which the inhabitants of the island of Atala sank into the Western Ocean. Similarly, even a little bit before that, and again, take the date of the Mahabharata with a grain of salt, but it's certainly written before Plato. But if we go back to something that can be quite, I would say, seriously dated, like the Turin Kings list from Egypt, which is pretty much agreed upon, comes from the 13th century BC. That's an even more compelling source, connecting, not just the Egypt story that Solon transmitted to Plato on his multi-year visit to the temple of, Neith in Sais and other parts of Egypt on kind of like an ambassadorship. But in the Turin Kings list, we've got a translation here from, well, this was I guess you could call him, he was a historian from the 70s and 80s, a guy named R. Cedric Leonard. He recently passed away, but he spoke many ancient languages. And in his translation, you can't determine if it's Auletian or Alretian because R and L in, I guess you could say, Kemetic, original Egyptian kind of language isn't exactly translated into, say, modern English, but it's close enough. And it lists in the current Kings list, which predates Plato by almost 1,000 years. It lists 10 Alretian or Auletian kings, god kings, who ruled in a foreign land during the reign of the gods before approximately 9850 BC, by his interpretation of this papyrus. And, if you recall, Plato, in his story that he told through Solon, describes that same timeline, 9,600 to 10,000, depending on how you want to look at the 9,000 years before your time, Solon date. And Solon would have been visiting around 560, 570 BC. But that's an interesting correlation because you got 10 Atlantean kings. It's exactly the same number in Plato's Timaeus and Critias for his version of it. So already before we get to the Greeks who were transmitting, of course, this ancient Egyptian story, we have here in the Turin King list their own version of events. And then again, coincidentally, a couple hundred years later, give or take, in India, we see the same story popping up. So this must have been a very important story if multiple cultures around the ancient world had the memory of it, just like the flood and many other events, the comet that we see all around the world in various iterations. Then we have from 735 BC, we have Hesiod, one of the first, Greek, I guess you've got classicists that we, if you study classics, you considered in the pre-Platonic world, Hesiod is a towering figure. And in his Theogony, he recounts a story in which the Titans, after losing a 10-year war, there we go again, just like the Mahabharata said, were imprisoned in a watery tomb beneath the Atlantic Ocean. And I'll call that chapter a watery tomb because of that. Then you have something that's been lost, sadly, to history, like so many things from 590 BC, Solon, who gave the story to Plato through, 3 or 4 intermediaries, Dropides, Critias, he was actually writing an epic poem called Atlantica that purportedly described the story of Atlantis in greater detail, which was possibly later condensed into the story that was transmitted to Plato, which is a much forgotten document because it's simply been lost. We have references to it, but nobody's ever recovered the actual poem, Atlantica. Then you've got 460 BC, so about 100 years before Plato's dialogues emerged. You've got Hellanicus, who wrote a book called Atlantis, which is a partially recovered chronology of the civilization, which has largely been lost to history. And I would say Hellanicus is an incredibly reputable source. It's not a frivolous kind of hearsay source. In fact, of all these sources, I think Hellanicus would be one of the strongest. So if he was talking about it, it must have carried more weight. And again, I've always said, I think this story had been in the imagination of the learned elite in the Mediterranean for many hundred years before Plato. Then you've got in Herodotus, 430 BC, where he says, and this is incredibly important to substantiate what we talked about last time about the idea of Atlantis being in the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean by Plato being described as an inland sea, because Herodotus says now the Caspian Sea is by itself not connected to the other sea, but the sea navigated by all the Greeks and the one, which would be the Mediterranean, and the one outside the pillars, Straits of Gibraltar, called the Atlantis Sea, and the Erythraean are one and the same. So to me, that actually, as I discovered, was the first reference in Greek to the Atlantic Ocean as the Atlantis Sea. And that's before Plato. That's 80 years before Plato wrote that.
I also found by reading Herodotus' stories that he mentions that nearby the Atlas Mountains, which has the same name, there lived Atlanteans, or people with a similar name to the name that Plato says the Atlanteans were called. So it is another thing, that it isn't only Herodotus speaking about the Atlantic Ocean, but he's speaking about some people on the area of current Sahara that were called Atlanteans. So for me, it is, when we think of a possible scenario of a destruction of Atlantis, we can think of people escaping the Atlantis to exactly this place, to Sahara, to Atlas Mountains, then to Spain and these regions.
Yes, and it's something that I we'll get back to pre-Platonic, but you mentioned a great point, Alex, which is, I think a lot of times people focus only on the diaspora after the fact. But as I discovered through particularly the work of Edgar Cayce and other kind of anthropological findings that would even predate the, let's say, 10,000 BC roughly destruction, or final and third destruction of a culture that I would argue lasted possibly 75 to 100,000 years, if you go back really to the original origin point, if you want to call it that. That while the civilization was even fully functioning before the Younger Dryas, and even centuries before the comet hit, they had colonies in these places. Plato himself says they had colonies in North Africa. So when you see Herodotus talking about the Atlantides in, let's say, Morocco and that area where the Atlas mountain range is, I think, it could have been, obviously, you're going to emigrate to your former colonies, or you're going to have knowledge of the former colonies in the event of a cataclysm. But I think also, in Edgar Cayce's account, there had already been expeditions to Central America in 22,000 BC. And the older you go back in the kind of temple records of the foundations of some of these sites in Mexico, where I live, you see 7, 8 different layers of situations built on top of each other, that some of which go back many thousands of years. So I think it's an incredible kind of diversity of sources that talk about just what Plato said, that these groups of people had colonies, as he mentions, all the way through Tyrrhenia, which is Italy.
Mhm.
So if you see anomalies in Sicily or Malta, perhaps, or even the southern Italian coast, all through North Africa up to Egypt, Plato said that specifically. So that's an important point. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes, I will also bring up because you spoke about Hellenicus, and I think that Hellenicus, as you mentioned, is one of the most credible evidence for pre-Platonic Atlantis, mention of Atlantis, or an idea of Atlantis. And there's an interesting thing because you mentioned that he called this poem Atlantis, and Atlantis, it is the same name if we type it in ancient Greek, because I learned a bit of ancient Greek. I'm not very proficient in it, but I can transliterate those letters, ancient Greek letters, and the word Atlantis is the same like in English. And Atlantis was used both by Plato and Hellenicus. And also, as you mentioned, Hellenicus brings up a similar story of these divisions of certain people, the genealogy of what would further be in these lost fragments, because his text is very scarce. We do not have, of course, the entirety of his text. Would bring us to later to the kings of Atlantis and to the story that Plato later told.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's not forget, Atlantis has absolutely no etymology in any known language. It's almost like you have to use self-referential etymology, where you see Atlan as a kind of root in Nahuatl, in Mexico, an indigenous language, in Yucatec. But it really is not a Greek word. So it's interesting also, that fact, and I have a whole little section later on that word. But to my knowledge, that was the first time the word in Greek
had been applied to that body of water, to Okeanos, from which we derive the ocean. He calls it the Atlantis Sea. So that's interesting. And then we've got in 400 BC, so getting closer to Plato, about 30, 40 years before he wrote Timaeus and Critias in 360 BC, we've got from the Roman Republic, early Roman Republic. Remember, Roman Republic's founded around 500, 530 BC. So this is early Roman Republic. And we've got Aelian in his Varia Historia. He explains how a man named Theopompus recorded an interview before the king of Phrygia, which would be kind of modern day Turkey, Armenia region, and Silenus, during which Silenus referred to a great continent beyond the Atlantic, larger than Asia, Libya, and what was then known as Europe combined. And let's forget that, Plato uses Libya and things like this himself. And of course, these aren't the modern borders of it. And I won't spend too much time, but these are much condensed versions of these modern countries. And so when they talk about Asia, they're not talking about larger than China and northern Russia and things like this. They're talking about the Middle East and, portions of North Africa, which would still be, significantly larger than the Hawaiian island chain, but not an enormous continental sized landmass. Because as I've mentioned before, all these ancient sources, all of them are referring to the final third iteration of Atlantis, which itself had been reduced after two previous cataclysms from a very larger, in that point, continent-sized landmass, traces of which I would say were the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, to a few smaller but still significant islands, Poseid, Og, and Arion, according to Edgar Casey, by the third and final destruction, which I would argue all final sources in history, the only historical sources we have from actual history, not clairvoyance, remote viewing, things like this, would have all been referring to the third and final, smaller, reduced version of the Atlantean saga. But that's the final source that I could find before we get to 360 BC, when Plato invented it all, Alex. He he made it up for his Athenian audience to be entertained, like he does with so many other things.
Mhm. Yes, that was an amazing list of sources. Actually, you put all the smoking guns. I thought we would just go
Smoking
into
guns. Here we go.
Ilian, into the Hellenicus, but you also brought up Mahabharata. That's why I was searching a quote for later from my book.
Yes.
And actually, I think we should continue with what I was very interested in, which was the Solon's journey to Egypt and a possibility that Solon really heard the story of Atlantis from priests in Egypt, whether at Sais or at any other location there. Because I wanted to start this search with a blank canvas. I wanted to start the search from just the texts, Timaeus, and especially Critias. Timaeus only speaks a little bit about the Atlantis. Critias is extensively describing it. And I thought, okay, Plato is telling us that it was Solon during his journeys to Egypt that heard the story of Atlantis at the city of Sais, and there the priests told him that 9,000 years before him there was this Atlantis and all the rest of the story. And I thought, okay, the biggest skeptical argument is that, as you mentioned, Plato invented this fairy tale, this just story, just this myth, and that he invented it for his own purposes, whether it was to show the ideal state or any other thing that he wanted to exemplify with the story of Atlantis. So I thought, okay, let's search, because here this is an accurate historical data that Plato is presenting to us. He isn't telling us that, oh, some random Greek went to Egypt and then they had this story of some random land. No, Plato is telling us, is actually listing us all the details, the location, so beyond the Hercules pillars, the date, 9,000 years before Solon, and many, many other
Well, and
things.
let me interject
Uh-huh.
briefly here, because this is something that I've always said. I say it to, my students. I still teach history occasionally. And I would say to all these debunking goofs out there as well. Let's talk about who we're dealing with here, just in the people of, say, Solon, the first Athenian law reformer in Western history, beloved by his people, considered, a wise sage, a real person. That would be equivalent of a world leader today vouching for this story. And then let's go to Plato. You're talking about one of the supreme geniuses of the Western world. In any topic you can imagine, Plato has covered it. The Matrix is based on a Platonic allegory. One of the
Yes.
most powerful meme in the world today is premised, as the writer herself said, on Plato's allegory of the cave. So these aren't stupid or simple people. These are towering figures of the past. And it really kind of irks me, the lack of respect that so many of these writers, when you read, newspapers, and I cite them in that chapter in the book on the debunking goofs in the world, presuming that you not only cannot learn anything from these geniuses, but that, oh, you know best. Yeah, you know better than the first Athenian law reformer in the first Western attempted democracy on planet Earth. You know better than the guy who discovered the Matrix through the Eleusinian mysteries, the man who, understood the motion of the planets, the man who, wrote dialogues that cover every aspect of human nature. You know better than him, right? And then he, in 360 BC, just took a wild guess and exactly pinpointed the end geologically of the Younger Dryas. That's quite curious
Yes.
to me. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. This is the biggest point, and as I mentioned, we should start. Like, if I knew nothing about the Atlantis except for these two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, where should I go? I would check out if the assertions stated by Plato, as you mentioned, the date of the end of the last ice age and the melting of the waters, and all the other things were right. And now we should go into Solon. Both Herodotus, you mentioned Herodotus a lot, and Plutarch are
Mm.
telling us that Solon truly went to Egypt, and even they are telling us that he was a little bit inspired by the Egyptian things, Egyptian laws that were later he came up with when it comes to the Greek Athenian lawmaking. And
Yes.
these are two of the biggest historians, but I am a little bit skeptical of Herodotus, especially what he was telling us about the pyramids and how they were built, because he
Absolutely.
is telling us that one of the pyramids was built using the stones that were given to a daughter of a pharaoh after being a prostitute. So one of his daughters was a prostitute, and every man gave her one rock, and that's how the pyramid was built.
Well, it's very interesting, and I talk a lot about that in the book. Herodotus, I would say, was wildly misguided in his appraisal of the pyramids, and you can tell that he has a political agenda to assert the kind of lesser status of the Egyptians himself, whereas Solon, I think, was there on a legitimately kind of investigation. I think Herodotus got a lot of things right, but the pyramids, and again, you have to remember at the time that Herodotus visited Egypt, according to, and I'll stand by this till the day I die until proven otherwise, the pyramids were built, according to Edgar Cayce, around 10,350 BC. And as strange as that might sound to people, I think, as we'll see later on, there's absolutely abundant evidence of that. In fact, they're aligned to that date in the precession of the equinoxes. And you can see Robert Bauval discovered this in the 80s. But Herodotus would have been, if he even could get access to people who would have known, they themselves might not have had any memory at that point of the actual construction techniques, because they might not have even been documented by the coalition that Edgar Cayce describes having built them, or it was a super secret that only temple initiates were allowed to get, not some arrogant Greek historian. And again, I would say, not to discredit Herodotus, considered the father of history, like Thucydides or something like that. But in that case, you can see his bias throughout his description, the Giza Plateau. So I'm glad you brought that up. The other thing,
I think that we will focus on the pyramids and stuff like that in the later episodes, so don't worry.
There's one more thing that I forgot, and that is there was a Athenian politician around 566 BC, so just after Solon, or around that time, named Pisistratus. And this is, I think, very interesting, and is not well understood, I think, by even people that look at pre-Platonic sources. And that is to say, 200 years before Plato wrote his dialogues about Atlantis, there had already been a celebration, a festival, to celebrate the defeat by Athena and, I guess you could say, the proto-Greeks or whoever was around at that time. And that's another story. A lot of people say, well, the Greeks could never have been at war with Atlantis at 9,600 BC. But have we really excavated everything down to the 10,000 BC layer around the Acropolis, which, by the way, Plato mentions was a much more ancient site in one of his dialogues? But it's interesting because 200 years before Plato emerged on the scene, there was already a physical celebration called the Lesser Pan-Athenaea. And it was a funeral procession where on a certain day, which, by the way, is the setting in one of the Platonic dialogues, where Socrates says, look, here on Athena's celebration, we should talk about why we're celebrating this, which, again, I think is totally ignored by this field. Why is Socrates telling the story on that day? Well, that's the day that Athena and the Greeks defeated this marauding group of Atlanteans. Plato says that this war took place around 9,600 BC, before the catastrophe. And in that funeral procession, a group of people walked down towards the Erechtheion, a temple in Athens, and they're carrying a kind of peplum or a shield, and on it is the story of the victory over this marauding group of sea people that came in from the Straits of Gibraltar and were defeated by some sort of iteration of what later became the Greeks. So again, I think and that's not a controversial fact. The Lesser Panathenaea is a very well understood fact in academic circles. So again, we don't have celebrations generally for fictional victories over fictional people. I'm not saying every single thing I'm saying is exactly true. I'm just saying you look at the body of evidence and the circumstantial evidence. And, as my friend and colleague Rob Nyland says, history is like a crime scene. You'll never know exactly how the murderer got in the window. You'll never know exactly what the victim's last words were. But as an investigator, you have to look at the majority of evidence in the crime scene and deduce without bias from that, even if it makes you uncomfortable or challenges your belief. And what are we seeing here? We're seeing an absolute, real, clear pattern emerge that this story was based in historical reality, that it was very important, that the trauma and the memory of this experience was transmitted globally, just like the flood. In fact, the two are inextricably linked. And
I think we will take another
Yep.
episode to just talk about the flood and flood myths and how the flood myths are connected to the story of Atlantis, because it isn't just a fact that Atlantis sunk and that there was a great flood. There are plenty more details when it comes to those floodings that may point that these stories of floods were exactly the same catastrophe that Atlantis sunk. So I think it will be for another episode. Now, because you brought us all this pre-Platonic stuff, I want to focus on Egypt. And
Sure.
as I mentioned, if I knew nothing about this extra stuff about Atlantis, if I knew only that there is the Timaeus and Crete, that Plato wrote it as an allegory, I will pretend I am that not into this topic. So, as I mentioned, I checked out historical things when it comes to Solon, that two other great historians are telling us that Solon really went to Egypt. So I can say that there is a high probability that this statement by Plato is true, that Solon really went to Egypt. Last time we checked other assertions, like beyond the Hercules pillars, you explained everything about that, about the ocean. So in this episode and the last, we explained that. Also, we mentioned the date, the ending of the last ice age. So these are like facts that we can physically and historically check.
Right.
And when it comes to this Egypt stuff, okay, so let's assume, because we have a high probability, that Solon really went to Egypt and then he heard the story. Are we having any evidence from ancient Egypt which shows similar things or any similarities to the story of Atlantis? You mentioned one source, the Turin Kings list, and I wanted to extend that with other sources from this region and other kings lists, because there are plenty of lists of kings from ancient Egypt. And what is most interesting is that we know from modern Egyptology, because we uncovered some of the bodies of the pharaohs that ruled throughout the years of the beginning of ancient Egypt, and we know that those lists of kings, like you mentioned, Turin's kings list, there is a Manetho's kings list, there is even older than the Turin's kings list by 1,000 years, Palermo stone, but there are many other lists. What is interesting is that Egyptology agrees about in 70% with all the chronology that is portrayed on this list of kings when it comes to all the chronological rulers, so from the first dynasty, the Narmer, first pharaoh according to Egyptologists. So from Narmer on until all those further dates, Egyptologists agree with about 70% what is told on those lists of kings. And I often mention these three lists of kings because you mentioned Turin's kings list, which is from around 1300 BC. We have 1,000 years before that the Palermo stone, and we have 1,000 years after Turin's kings list, so most recent text, which is Manetho's kings list from about 3rd century BC. So all this list of kings are telling us almost the same story, similar chronological data about different rulers, but what is interesting is that all of these texts and many other lists of kings are telling us that there were rulers before Narmer the first pharaoh, before him, and they were telling us that there were different rulers, and before these rulers there were even some demigods, gods, and stuff like that. And what is interesting is that those lists of kings are very, very similar to each other. They have some differences, okay, there are all these texts are 1,000 years apart from each other, so that's why there are differences between them, but they are telling us that the history of Egypt is much older than the first alleged ruler by Egyptology, and that the history of ancient Egypt goes to around 36,000 years BC or even more.
Yes.
So I see a similarity here, because we see in the Platonic dialogues that Plato mentions different rulers, different genealogies of rulers, and here we also have different dynasties put together and how they were ruling particular regions. Another thing,
and I would also add a third person that would confirm Solon's account, which was Crantor, who actually went to the temple of at Sais and claims to have seen the story of Atlantis written on one of the pillars. Another reputable ancient source. I would also add the work of one of Rob Nyland's friends, his kind of partner that goes out there to Egypt with him, who I speak to occasionally. Again, a guy named Manu Saifzadeh, who wrote a few books on the subject of the connection between Atlantis and Egypt. And, you know, he was recently out there at the Temple of Edfu. He's one of the few people that can actually decipher a lot of these hieroglyphs. And, you know, he found some very interesting evidence on the story of Atlantis at the Temple of Edfu, and he wrote a great article about it on Graham Hancock's website. And I'd love to have him on at some point, because I think what he showed was, you know, we know that Solon himself said with the names of some of these Atlantean kings that Solon had to Hellenize the names. And as Manu argues, it's possible even that the original Atlantis, as would have been documented, might not even appear anything like that word, or might have been referred to in a different kind of type of way. As he notes, you know, there is a story at the Temple of Edfu about the place of the pristine waters, as they call it, which was basically, as they describe, you know, the same story, this origin point in the Western Ocean that was destroyed many thousands of years ago, from which Egyptians descend through the admixture of native people and the influx of people from Atlantis, which itself was by then a multicultural global empire. So it's important to note that, you know, even today there's existent or extant physical archaeological evidence that does allude to this story. It's not just that, you know, we have ancient sources. We still have, you know, I don't think the column is still there at Sais to witness that temple.
No.
You know,
I found because I was searching for no copyright old pictures to my book to use about Egypt, etc. And I found a very early, from about 1700s AD, like lithograms showing that probably it was this temple that Plato and Solon was mentioning, but there was a mention that there was a collapsed temple at Sais and nothing almost
I have
survived.
that, actually. I used that lithogram in my book. Yes, it's like an old wood carving.
Haven't noticed. Really nice.
Yes,
but I wanted to go into the Temple of Edfu stuff because I researched it a bit too, but the problem with the Temple of Edfu, just to clarify, is that Temple of Edfu is not pre-Platonic, it is after Platonic.
That's right.
Another thing is that, okay, and actually a few Egyptologists agree with this statement, that Temple of Edfu has some very, very old knowledge inscribed on the walls, because these are the walls of the Temple of Edfu where the Edfu texts are located. So this is another stuff. But I wanted to show that pre-Platonic sources, like those lists of kings, Palermo Stone, Turin's kings list, and
Right.
showing from a blank canvas that I do not know anything about Atlantis, we can actually deduce and research everything that it is highly probable that Solon went to Egypt, probably he went there, and then we see that we have similar stories before Plato, this is very
Yes.
important, that show us similar things to the story of Atlantis very long ago, thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years of history. This is very important to me. And now when it comes, so we see that it is very probable that Solon really went to Egypt and then there he acquired all the knowledge about Atlantis. This is what I wanted to say. But now coming back to the Temple of Edfu, I opened the date to show everyone. The completion date of the temple is 57 BC, so long after Plato, but it
Right.
started about 237 BC, which is still after more than 100 years after Plato. But when it comes to the Edfu text, there are very other key ideas which may connect to these pre-Platonic sources. And why? Because you mentioned this island. It was this island of gods. Those gods that we said, according to those pre-Platonic lists of kings, were ruling in a very deep prehistory, similar to the rulers that Plato was telling were ruling Atlantis, 10 kings divided, etc. So this is a similarity, but what is interesting is that in the Edfu text at the Temple of Edfu, which may have been inspired by Plato because they are after Plato, but may not. They may be inspired by other sources, pre-Platonic, that are non-existent today. We haven't found them, or they were just simply destroyed. And there is a mention of this island ruled by gods, and there are, I think, mentions of 2 catastrophes, which is similar to what you're saying with the research on Edgar Cayce and other psychic medium stuff, that those people were telling us that it was not a single destruction of Atlantis, but series of destructions. So this is a very key component to that. And another thing is that you mentioned that it was this very clear water or something, but after that it was called an island or a sea of reeds. And a sea of reeds, this is an interesting part because almost the same thing can be found in Mesoamerica. We have mentions that there was a sea of reeds. And another thing is, we mentioned it in our last episode, that Plato is telling us that even during his time, the place on the ocean where Atlantis was located was not navigable. So it was destroyed. Maybe there was plenty of ruins of it or something, which is for me similar to the Sea of Reeds, that is too not navigable because you cannot navigate, you cannot sail through this Sea of Reeds. And another thing is, you mentioned the pyramids. This actual island was, because it was a true historical fact, but also a metaphorical component into it, because when it comes to the Egyptian cosmology, there is that at the beginning there were the infinite waters of Nun, and from these waters there appeared the primeval hill, this what was later of course symbolized by the pyramids, by the Benben stone, the capstone of the pyramids, this primeval mound. And I think it is similar to what Plato is telling us, that at the center of Atlantis, of this city or of this country, civilization, whatever we may call it, there was this hill, and on this hill there was placed the Temple of Poseidon, which is similar to this idea that there was some kind, an island of gods that was destroyed, and it was like the first land, but first land historically, that it could be some kind of hill, but it could be also metaphorical, that it was the first land, like the place from which humanity emerged. Like from Atlantis, there emerged other people, like survivors from Atlantis, or maybe, as you mentioned, colonies could be created from this single island. But it was also metaphorical in the metaphysical sense that the pyramids were actually, as I mentioned, symbols of this long lost and forgotten land that was some kind of mount, pyramid or something hill, like Plato is telling us. So this is very important when it comes to understanding the Edfu text, that they may have had some inspiration from Plato, but here we've got, for instance, the pyramid side, which we'll cover in the future videos, how old are the pyramids, how they are connected with Atlantis, because you mentioned that they are much older, that they have a connection with Atlantis, and this may be the case because we see that those pyramids, when they were built, may be symbolical of that lost land. So maybe after the destruction of Atlantis, people built the pyramids because they wanted to commemorate that
Well,
stuff. So this is
it's
very
interesting.
important.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we won't go too much into the pyramids, but I would add that in my investigation, particularly the Great Pyramid at Giza, and you have to go to say Edgar Cayce, and to me, one of the most important clairvoyant remote viewing source in the world, most well documented, most verified with pretty much everything he said in terms of medical readings and archaeological findings in his own time bore out to be true. And I'll just add, just briefly, as a little teaser, if people think that this isn't real, well, recall that the CIA for the last 50 years has been using remote viewers for military intelligence purposes. They're all highly documented and now declassified files. So it is real. And the process through which you can achieve that, we can describe in another episode. But just to give you an example, when I say, well, Edgar Cayce said this or that from his hypnagogic trance, 80 years ago, recall that he discovered a ancient river that used to be an extension of the Nile that emptied into the Atlantic Ocean, actually, around 12,000 years ago, before the Cataclysm. He said this in the 20s. And it wasn't until 1986 that actual space shuttle imaging radar confirmed exactly what he said was true. There was a subterranean river that did start at the Nile headwaters and emptied into the Atlantic Ocean. He also was the first person ever, in my understanding, in my 10-year investigation, to put the date of the Great Pyramids building at 100 years in total, how long it took, using levitation and electrogravitas, anti-gravity decoupling stones from gravity is how he describes it. And he puts that date around 10,450 BC for its start and finished at 10,350 BC by a coalition of Atlanteans who had actually anticipated the coming destruction and went to Giza to create a kind of refuge and storehouse for much of the knowledge, including the Hall of Records, which we can talk about another time. But that the Giza Plateau itself was actually constructed largely before and then added on to after the Cataclysm, which didn't have as dramatic an effect on Giza as it did, say, on the island of Atlantis. And so I think there's a lot of purposes to the pyramid. I think it's much more than just a symbolic. I think as a technology, as Christopher Dunn.
One thing I can add, because in this episode we focus on historical stuff, is what can confirm what Casey was saying. During the medieval times, Arab chroniclers were searching what locals were telling them about the pyramids, and they found out that according to local Coptic people, pyramids were actually built in order to preserve knowledge, probably from a great deluge. There is this mention of a King Surit who, like 100 or 300 years before the Great Flood, had a vision, had a dream that there will be a huge deluge, and he built the pyramids in order to preserve knowledge. And they are even telling us that they entered the pyramids as one of the first people, and they found their things that were out of their realm because they were so advanced. There were metals that are not rusting, and there were plenty of other stuff.
Glass that could bend but not break.
Which
again, think about that. Those stories are from medieval Arab chroniclers, like Al-Masudi, for example, that talks about Surid and things like this. And to talk about, metals that don't rust, like orichalcum, like Plato described, or glass that can bend without break. You're talking about highly advanced technologies, which, a lot of people, again, we're so arrogant. We just resort to, well, that's a story like the Arabian Nights or something like this. That's a nice fictional story. But the problem is when you have, Casey never read medieval Arab texts. And I'll point that out over and over. Casey, according to his son and his family, only read the Bible and the newspaper and had a handful of romance novels when a debunker from Harvard University surprised him in a visit that I document in the book. It's one of the most important attempts to critique Edgar Casey that blew up in the face of this Harvard psychologist who was annoyed that Casey was getting popular and treating people through clairvoyance for health issues. So he showed up at his house and thought, well, this guy's just cherry picking facts from almanacs and things like this. And he discovered he watched a health reading with another doctor from Princeton and said, this person is able to remote view illness and the past. And it's shocking. And we don't have an explanation for it. Well, it's the same thing with, one of the great joys in writing this book was looking at things that there's no way Casey in Hopkinsville, Kentucky in 1922 was going to the National Archives with an Arabic translator to read Al-Masudi and things like this. He wasn't. He was just accessing a super conscious field called the Akashic Record, and to the best of his ability, describing what his channel or his, super conscious connection was, bringing forth. And so I think it's incredibly important because, again, if you look at the Greek sources like Herodotus, they're clearly biased with the pyramid. And if you look at the Egyptians, there is no evidence whatsoever. There is no written document anywhere in ancient Egypt that describes the construction or function of the Great Pyramid. And I'll never refer to it as the Khufu Pyramid because it was never built by Khufu. And we see a lot of evidence of why that's not the case. It's like, I always tell people, if you discovered the Empire State Building in 10,000 years, which it wouldn't even be there, but let's just say it was megalithrically constructed, and you saw the word Starbucks etched into the wall, would you declare Starbuck built the empire? And that's literally all the evidence we have that Khufu, when Howard Weiss went in there and allegedly found this cartouche that says Khufu above the king's chamber, scratched in, red ochre or something like this. And that's basically where we went with it, because we have an obsession in Western history to be able to say yes or no. There is no middle ground in the historical field. And it's something that really is a major gap in our way of thinking. If we were being honest, if Egyptologists were being honest, they would say, we actually have no idea who built this. We have no idea when. We have no idea how. And we have no idea what it does. But we don't like that because we went to the moon and we've got rockets that can, allegedly, and we have rockets that can land, backwards and things like this. So we don't like the idea of not having certainty. But when you look at what the actual, like you said, Coptic, locals who were talking to these Arab travelers and what they said, none of them said, oh, this was built as a tomb for Khufu, like the other, mausoleums and pyramids around the ancient world. None of them said that. They all said it was built before the coming cataclysm as a storehouse, as a last redoubt for people who knew their civilization was ending. So I think, again, these have been totally overlooked and lost, this Egyptian connection to the Atlantis story. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why that is, because as we mentioned, Solon says this story comes from Egypt. And let's not recall, the Egyptians at the Temple of Neith at Sais told him. And really, they're talking to us because we're the inheritors of Western history. You Greeks or you Western historians today, like Michael Shermer, you're like little children because you write everything down in books.
And have so a history of the last few thousand years and not tens of thousands of years.
At best. And we Egyptians carve things in monuments of stone. And so if you really push that saying, as the Egyptians told Solon, let's recall as well that when they told him that, they specifically said the earth was destroyed by the declination, by the declination of heavenly bodies. So objects falling from the sky rained on Earth and wiped out whatever was there around 9600 BC. That's what they told Solon. We now know that did happen. Almost unequivocally, that did happen. That we passed through the Taurid meteor stream and a few fragments did hit the Earth over a period probably of a few hundred years.
I think our
so-
next episode, episode 3, will be all about. We can either go into the catastrophe, which in my opinion would be a natural route from this episode, or we can go into psychic, Casey, and stuff like that. So
Fantastic.
for everyone watching, in future episodes we'll cover both the pyramids, the psychic stuff, the flood, catastrophes, and many other episodes. Therefore, don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we will be showing you many more things.
Yes, indeed. Well, again, thank you so much, Alex. You're a very wise person, full of information. And again, you know, I tell people what we're trying to do here is be real with you and not come at you from some kind of erudite academic perspective, but at the same time, you know, I'm a professional historian. Alex has read 1,000+ books on ancient history and the world, even though he's how old are you? 22, 23 years
I'm
old.
still 21 during the day of the recording, but I'm 22 in
brother.
April.
No, and it's impressive. It's impressive. And, you know, I think that's really why I wrote my book. And I think it's probably why you wrote Déjà Vu, is that the whole field is so scattered, so arrogant on both sides. You know, I don't pick just on debunkers. Debunkers are necessary. It's like anything in life. You need people to check you and challenge you, because there is a lot of BS out there on Atlantis, even with clairvoyance. That's why I really focused on documented cases of clairvoyance that had evidence in other cases, and then looked at what they said about Atlantis. But I think what we're trying to do is just set the record straight. You know, that's what I tried to do, you know, in my book, and also keep it interesting, because it's one of the most fascinating missing keystones that when you understand it, it unlocks. It's like the master key. I've always said that it unlocks so many anomalies across the continents that make no sense without a global common link, whatever you want to call it, whenever it existed, that really did exist in the mid-Atlantic, from which you could navigate to Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and North and South America. It doesn't actually have to be some sort of like mythical. It's not mythical, you know, it's a historical mystery, but that's what we're here on the show to explore. And it's an endless source to me of intrigue. And I think we're getting closer by the day to cracking the case.
Thank you very much. Today you provided us with so many information, but in the future videos we will show you even more stuff connected from not only all around the world as today, but also from all the areas of life and knowledge, from history, archaeology, through physics, and even metaphysics, so what lies beyond the physical realm. That's why you need to subscribe to us and stay tuned for other episodes. All the links to our books will be in the description below, and we highly recommend you all reading them, because these have lots of knowledge.
Yes,
here
indeed.
and here I've got mine, but I have a card in it, but you know, tons of knowledge. And as you mentioned, our idea is to show almost everything and try to decode one of the biggest mysteries of our entire history.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Alex. It's always a pleasure. And until next time.